The African American Legend series highlights the accomplishments of blacks in areas as varied as politics, aviation, business, sports, literature, and religion. We will explore how African Americans have succeeded in areas where they'd been previously excluded because of segregation, racism, and lack of opportunity. I'm your host, Dr. Roscoe C. Brown, Jr., and with us today is Howie Evans, the sports editor of the New York Amsterdam News. Welcome to African American Legends again, Howie.
Well, thank you, Doc. This is a great setting. I always enjoy sitting here.
Well, I enjoy seeing
behind
you
history.
because the Amsterdam News does present information about African American sports figures in ways that the larger press does not. And a lot of that is due to the way in which you and your staff go out to cover games and get the particular nuances that relate to the black community. Now, this year's been a very interesting year in New York in sports. We've had the Yankees, we've had the Mets, we've had the Giants, we have the Knicks, we have the Nets, we have the Jets. None of them made any championships this year. Yet at the same time, many of the athletes that people identify with were the black athletes, the leaders of the team. To what extent do you think most of management and most of New York realizes how important black athletes are to sports in New York?
Well, I think from a marketing standpoint, you really have to separate the two. The star player who is performing, like overnight, Amare Stoudemire has become like almost the LeBron James, the Bryant, and everybody else of New York. Everywhere you go, you see him. But they have marketed him that way, and I think they've encouraged him to get out in the public, to become the face of the Knicks. But as much as he seems to enjoy that, I don't think that he is ready to embrace that type of celebrity.
That type of role. And the other thing is, the team wins 4 games, and then they lose 6 games. And the New York fans are very hot and cold. When you're winning, you're the greatest, and when you're losing, you're the worst. And I think that's reflected in what happens with the Jets, it's what happened with the Mets, etc. In your opinion, you've been around a long time, which of the franchises do you think have done the best job of profiling their black athletes?
Well, I would have to say the Knicks. And I say it in this respect, Doc, in that just not on the court, but off the court.
Very good point.
They have those guys out in the community, and they seem to enjoy it. You know, we run a program in New York called Citywide Athletic Association, and the Knicks are involved with the program. Last summer, Clyde came up.
That's Walt Frazier.
Walt Frazier. He came up, and he sat in the sun for like 3 hours, 3 or 4 hours. And he was on his way to St. Croix, and they had the limousine outside waiting for him. But he was enjoying himself just being with the kids. The place was packed, but they stood around and they sat around, they talked with the kids. And the kids weren't even really asking for autographs. You know, black kids are somewhat different than some of the other kids. They just enjoy being around these guys, touching them, and acting like, well, Walt is our man. You know, we don't need his autograph. Just him being here. And he didn't have to go through that of people asking him for the autograph or anything, you know. So in that respect, the Knicks have those guys out. They bring back the ex-players. Willis Reed comes in quite often during the season and does things and all. And it's always seemingly like the black athletes who are out in the community. I very seldom see other athletes out there.
Well, it's very interesting. I was thinking about it as you were talking. There are relatively few players on basketball, you know, 12, 14, 15. There are 25, 35 in baseball and 55, 65 in football. And many of the teams tend to organize groups of players to come. Your point was the one-on-one, which is very, very sensitive and very, very important, which raises the question, could not baseball and football do the same thing, send out 1 or 2 rather than sending out, you know, 5 or 6 or half the team?
Yeah. Well, they're getting a little better at that. But what I've found is that a lot of the players, the baseball guys like CC Sabathia, he's great going out into the community, and very often he seems to be doing that on his own.
On his own.
And you know, they'll send, they don't even tell you. You can always tell when the club is organizing something because they bombard you with emails and all of this. And then all of a sudden you see something that CC Sabathia has done or one of the other guys have done, and you said, hey, wait a minute, we didn't even know about this, and he's out there. And I think also the thing with baseball is that they play so many games, and their travel is somewhat different than basketball, where in basketball the guys play in Washington today, and the next night they're in Los Angeles somewhere. In baseball, the guys come in and they spend 3 or 4 days, and they're laying around in a city where, you know, wherever. And it's somewhat different.
Well, one thing though, I think the management of the teams now realize that they need to have more community activities. All of the teams, the Mets, the Yanks, the Knicks, whatever, to just have a community activity. And I think one of the things that sort of gets in the way of this sometimes is the agent, because the agents sometimes want the athletes to get fees, etc. So I imagine that in many of the contracts now, they're writing in a stipulation that you have to do so many hours or so many days of community service and community projects, which is, I think, is a good idea.
Well, they encourage the players to, you know, to get involved, and the Nets do a great job in terms of getting out in the community, just not in New York, but in New Jersey. In some instances, the New Jersey Nets out-hustle the Knicks in New York. And the young man, Devin Harris, seems like he's out every single night doing something in the community. And during the Thanksgiving holidays, I can think of at least 20 athletes or more who were out giving out turkeys and you know, and all of that kind of stuff, dressing up at Christmas time. Anthony Mason, who no longer plays with the Knicks, he spent a whole day up in the Bronx, and he dressed up in a Santa outfit, and he looked like Santa because now he weighs over 300 pounds.
Right, that's true. Now, the other thing is, in doing this type of community service, how much of it do you think relates to academic activity? How much do they really talk about doing well in school, graduating from school? It seems to me it's logical because you can't go to college unless you graduate from high school. On the other hand, so many athletes in training spend so much time on their athletics that they don't put enough time on their studies. To what extent do the athletes deal with the academic aspect of this?
Well, the pro guys getting around the Knicks and the Nets in particular in basketball, they seem to be more directed in that area of always talking about education. Even the guys who didn't go to college, as you know, many of the basketball players, you know, they're one and done and they're out. But they emphasize education, and many of the programs, like at some of the children aid centers and some of the park department facilities,
Boys and Girls Club.
Boys and Girls Club.
Why?
It's always an educational theme. Which is good, and even if the players have not been through school for 4 years, they understand the importance of it.
It's interesting. I was thinking 40 or 50 years ago, it wasn't a question of would an athlete graduate from college. It's when he would graduate. He might be in the summer, might be in the fall. Now, because of the attraction of money, many of them, you say, one and done, 1 year and gone, or 2 years and gone. You know, the society changes, which leads me to ask you, you've been covering sports for 35, 40 years. How do you think sports have changed in the black community during that time, other than the fact that they can play in the major leagues where 50 years ago they couldn't? But other than that, how do you think the sports have changed in relation to black athletes in the time you've been covering them?
I think the most important thing that has changed is the financial aspect of it. Whereas years ago, back in the 60s, for instance, like up at in the Holcomb Rucker Summer Pro League. They always had some of the greatest players out there playing in that sun continuously all day. But many of those guys also had jobs in the summer. Like I remember Satch Sanders and guys like Mel Davis, and all these guys worked in community programs when the season was over. But as the salary started escalating, and these guys were able to jet across the country, and all of that changed. And you didn't see, and that's what ultimately killed the Summer Pro League, the Rucker League in particular, because now these guys had money, and they didn't have to like just stay in New York and play on the playgrounds. They were all over the country, you know, enjoying each other, doing this, doing that, going to Europe, and so forth. So that was the major difference that I've seen over the years.
What about the presence of black coaches in the major professional sports?
Well, the NBA does a good job of that, more so than some of the other leagues. The NBA doesn't have, say, like a Stern rule where you have to a minority has to be interviewed.
Even though they don't get the job.
Yeah, that doesn't happen in, pardon me, in the NBA. In the NBA, many, pardon me, Roscoe. In the NBA, most of the players are former players. Most of the coaches are all former players. It's almost like a close-knit fraternity that if you didn't play in the NBA, you can't come back and coach in the NBA. And the NBA benches are littered with assistant coaches who all played in the league. You don't see that like in the NFL. You don't see it in baseball.
That's interesting. Why do you think that is?
I think it's the emphasis really has to come from the top.
From the top. Well, that's what Dan Rooney was trying to do with the Rooney Rule. It says every NFL team, before they hire a coach, has to interview a minority candidate. And some instances worked. We've had Mike Tomlin in the Super Bowl. We've had Lovie Smith in the Super Bowl. We had Jim Caldwell in the Super Bowl. We had Herman Edwards with the Knicks. We had a whole bunch of them. Some of them don't last very long, like Mike Singletary was out in South California for a while. So it has worked, but in some instances, like anything else, if you want to avoid it, you do. You have a token interview, but the pressure is on, and I think as the population of the country changes to be more minority, it's estimated that by 2050, about half of this country will be people of color. It'll be easier for the management to hire and look at a person of color as a coach. I think that'll happen over time. Now, the other issue that I know you're interested in is the potential lockout by both football and basketball as they develop a new collective bargaining agreement. The idea is they won't let the players come to training camp, they won't pay them, they won't have a contract, and they want them to extend the season. In football and in basketball, they want some give-backs in terms of how much money goes to the players. How do you think this is going to work out?
Well, as you know, everything involves money, and that's
what it's all about.
That's
right?
basically what it's about. The owners don't want to give up nothing, and they're the ones who have the money. And many of the owners now are close to being billionaires, many of them.
And the team is sort of a hobby more than a business.
Yeah.
But they don't want to lose money on the hobby.
Well, you know, it's interesting. Last 2 weekends, looking at the box scores and looking at the attendance figures, they had, on last Saturday night, they had 12 games around the country. And every single one of those games, even with the teams that were in the basement, averaged over 18,000. And these were teams who will never win and who have not won and who are still at the bottom of the basement.
This is in the NBA.
In the NBA. The NFL continues to be a major money maker.
The thing that I'm concerned about, and I shouldn't be because I don't have the money, if they set up a lockout, they may set up a situation where people lose interest. When baseball had their strike, it took them 4 or 5 years to gain back. So I guess the push-pull on both the part of the players, and it's more on part of the players, because the player's career is only 4 or 5 years, and if the player loses out a year or so, and it takes another 2 years to get back to where he was, it's, to me, not in the player's interest to do lockout. For the owners, they may think they're going to save some money by not having to pay as much, but it seems to me it wouldn't be in their interest as well, because the public loses interest, and the public's interest span is very short. If the public loses interest, they may find it takes 2 or 3 years to get the public interest back.
Yeah, well, I see that in I could see that in a lot of sports. Like, well, baseball now is going through the thing to see the collective bargaining. Football is going through it also. But in football, since they only play 1 game a week, the thirst is hungrier, you know, than it is in baseball where they play 4 and 5 games a week, you know. So it's somewhat different there. Then the owners have always have the big stick, because in base football, the players, their longevity is not as long as in baseball. You can see guys 42 and 43 years old still
and doing well,
playing well. In football, the average running back in the NFL career is like 2 or 3 years. Right. The average running back.
Because they get hit.
Yeah, they just get beat up and all, and they just roll in a new batch. So that collective bargaining thing is heavily weighed in favor of the owners, although the union is doing a good job.
Mm-hmm. But the interesting thing behind all of this is television. The television contract and the television revenues generates the amount that allows people to pay millions of dollars in salaries. And apparently the players want a larger percent of that revenue, and the owners, of course, want a larger percent. So this is a push-pull, and it's in most negotiations, I think it'll depend on who holds out the longest.
Well, that may well be, but you have to understand also, Doc, that it's 2 against 1. Mm-hmm. It's the owners and the TV people against the union and the players. That the odds there are very heavily weighed towards those owners and the TV people, because what was the old saying about whoever got the money, or whatever that saying is, but
calls the tune, right?
Hey, listen, the players can hold up but so long, because many of them are on the low end in terms of making money. That's why the union issued a thing telling the players to save your paychecks. They've told that. They've sent a letter out to the players.
I heard.
And these are not the guys now. We hear about guys like Aaron Rodgers and some of the quarterbacks making $18 million a year, and that's true.
The average one makes about $500.
The average player in that league is making nowhere near that. They're happy if they're making $700,000 or $800,000.
It's interesting how we could be so cavalier about only making $700,000 or $800,000.
Yeah.
But the thing we have to realize, a lot of it goes to taxes, a lot of it goes to lifestyle, and their career span is very, very low.
Yeah.
I mean, if they have the average career of any player in the NFL is about 4.5 years. So we have to understand that as we go through it.
Well, look at the Jets. They're going to break up that team because of money.
Because of money.
Because they have all of these free agents now. And as much money as Woody Johnson has, he's a billionaire, he don't want to give up nothing.
And he's probably not giving it up himself. He's probably taking it from the resources he gets from attendance, although he did put a lot of money.
They get revenue from apparel and all, which, by the way, is a story within itself. And that, you remember when the players are wearing these skull caps and all, and then they told the players, you can't wear them anymore.
Yeah.
So the players couldn't wear them anymore. But what did the NFL do? They went and put their brands on the same skull caps that they told the players they couldn't wear.
And now they can wear.
Now they can wear them because it's.
Now you've been covering sports for a long time and doing it very well. As you think back on the history of the black athletes, which of the athletes you think have had the most impact, number one, on race relations, and number two, on sports themselves? There are two kinds of impact, on race relations and on sports. Who do you think had the most impact in each of those areas?
Well, that's a good question, but it's a difficult question because you're talking about in baseball. Let's take baseball now, where the number of African Americans in baseball is at an alarmingly low number, and most of these kids don't ever go to college. So you have to weigh the intelligence factor of that. When they have to get involved in issues that determine that degree of having to deal with things other than how much money that they're going to make, it's very hard.
But in history, I think people like Jackie Robinson and Joe Louis and Jesse Owens and Jack Johnson made major changes in the way in which black athletes had opportunities and the way in which the white community viewed the black community. When Jack Johnson first beat Jim Jeffries, there were race riots all over because said no black man should beat a white man. When Joe Louis beat Max Smelling, he was a hero because he was beating up the Nazi, or the Nazi representative. Smelling wasn't a Nazi. Now when we have championship fights, most of them are with people of color. The idea of the white hope is long gone. So that it has had, but particularly boxing had an impact on race relations. Baseball also had an impact on race relations because of Jackie Robinson breaking that barrier that baseball was segregated for all those many years. And then they had many black people come to the parks, black kids having somebody to look forward to. And as you say, it attracted a number of black young people to play baseball, but they didn't need a college education. Now we have the people like Jim Brown, particularly many years ago, and the many great black football players now attracting more black kids to play football. So how do you think it's going to work out over time?
Well, first, we have to go back into history and we look at that very question that you're talking about and that you posed to me, and that it has been the black basketball player who really broke down the barriers of segregation in this country in hotels, in restaurants, and so forth, and in particular Bill Russell.
Now you mean
remember that
after Jackie Robinson?
Yeah,
because,
but Jackie
Bill
Robinson was a pioneer, and he kind of, but remember in those first few years, they still, even though he opened the door, there were still hardly any blacks. You know, there was Larry Doby and then
Monty
Don
Irvin,
Newcomb and Monty, but it was only a handful of them. Whereas the guys in basketball, with a smaller group of people, they were able to say, well, tell Red Auerbach, we're not going to stay at this
But remember, the Celtics were unusual because they were one of the first teams to put 5 black players on the court at that time. And even the Celtics had a quota system. So I don't necessarily think that basketball was way out in front. I think by circumstance, because they were a smaller number of people able to make a change.
Yeah.
But Jackie and Roy, for example, Roy Campanella, refused to stay in a segregated hotel in St. Louis, and that broke the barrier for black Major League Baseball players to play. In football, because they had their own training camps and so on, the racial separation patterns lasted a lot longer until finally the numbers overwhelmed the system. So it's like almost anything else in race relations. We start with small steps, which in history we call now giant steps. But they're small steps, and it depends on the nature and the organization of the sport. And also depends on
we got to remember, though, that there was one man who has never really gotten full credit for helping to break down those barriers, and that was Red Auerbach.
Very good point.
Even Red Auerbach, all he wanted to do was win. Red Auerbach loved black basketball players. He would carry the bags when the Harlem Renaissance were playing around the Eastern Coast. He would go and pick up the bags so he could carry them in and get into the games free. And of course, when he became the coach and the general manager, it wasn't about color with him. He wanted to win.
It's a very good point, because Red Auerbach grew up around in Washington, D.C., went to George Washington University, and he knew and played with a lot of black players. And this is, in a sense, the history of race in America anyway. We had black scientists work with white scientists, even though they didn't get the credit. We had black writers writing great things, even though they didn't get published. So in a sense, sports mirrors the history that we've had as black people. And I think it's important when we talk about sports on African American Legends is to relate it to the struggle and the progress that we've made. I like to talk about the progress rather than the struggle, but progress comes because of struggle.
Exactly.
And many of these black athletes contributed to that.
Well, sports changed society in this country. Not the entertainers, not the scientists, not the teachers. It was sports who changed society as we know it.
And again, on African American Legends, we've been talking with Howie Evans, sports editor of the New York Amsterdam News, reflecting on the importance of sports in our community. Thanks for being with us today, Howie.
Thank you, Doc. Enjoyed it.